Well, before we get to our guests and everything, I did want to start this show with a commentary about something that very much affects the left and Marxists. There are kind of like liberal countercultural aspects of this phenomenon, but I think it's something that's very much worth addressing as we're in this moment of rebuilding and reimagining what we need to be doing in the future. Um, y'all might know the line. It's a pretty roaring and thunderous one at the end of the Communist Manifesto, right? Workers of the world unite. You've got nothing to lose but your chains. And that can, build up the spirit, make your cheeks a little bit red, get you excited. But the question, when you read that in 2022, it has to be asked. It's been since 1848, since that moment when this was written, and we're still waiting. Despite capitalism expanding and proletarianizing billions across the globe, it can sometimes feel like Marx and Engels were much closer in a way to a global workers' revolution than some of us living today, right? That system, the system of capitalism, of the dictatorship of the bosses and the rich, has become more powerful. But it's also become very much implanted in our daily lives and our common sense. I mean, most people don't recognize that this is not the natural order. This is something that we as human beings have created. And capitalism has certainly subsumed so many other traditions, both culturally and spiritually. One example is look at the churches in America. It's not like the churches have been sort of immune from getting caught up and making money and scams and all that kind of stuff. But look at the traditional, for example, like Southern Baptist Church here. I mean, it feels very, very much like a business in the fullest sense. Right? It's just amazing to see a tradition that's as old as that, thousands of years old, become so incorporated into a capitalist system.
Look at
Right?
the Falwells, right? The righteous gemstone inspirees.
No, I mean, no doubt about it, right? Like, this is what I'm saying. It's like, this is an old tradition. This is thousands of years old, and it just has become incorporated into capitalism in such a way that it might seem to some of us like it's always been this way, and that's not been the case, right? So in spite of all of this historic weight lining up to show that there's these problems with these systems, we're just not there yet when it comes to the radical movements to overcome it. And this is why this is a question that any serious political thinker has to wrestle with, right? Despite all of the crimes and alienation and misery that you can see as a part of this system, why have we not been able to overcome it, right? The fact is that a socialist revolution is not just going to happen mechanically, automatically. That means that we actually have to build the conditions ourselves for change. And I think that is one thing that we understand a lot more today than maybe folks did a couple hundred years ago, that like, it's not just going to happen because things are going to get worse, right? We actually have to understand that we must play an active role in this movement. I preface this just to take people through, like, the most zoomed out lens version of why there is this kind of crisis in socialist and Marxist thought, right? You feel like we've pointed out the contradictions. Things have only gotten worse since, for example, the Communist Manifesto was written. And we still have not seen a collective, we've seen pockets of resistance in socialist revolutions for sure, but it hasn't been this kind of global world revolution that people were hoping for at that time. So in the shift in hope, right, when people, particularly in the 1950s in the West, started to feel like this revolution is not around the corner. In fact, that maybe it's a revolution that was denied to us. Many did, and we still are in this era. They did what we call the cultural turn, right? The fight became not just about being against capitalism in general, organizing people into mass movements to challenge the system, and planting yourself into the labor movement. Intellectually, at least, it became about developing a critique of contemporary society and culture in the hope that this could, unlock a key to the answer, right? Why the revolution hasn't happened yet. And I don't want to say that investigating mass culture and ideology, is unimportant. It absolutely is. We do that on this show as well. But I want to note one specific consequence of that I think is very pervasive, not just amongst the Marxists and socialists, it's across the board, particularly with liberals. But I wanted to point it out and show why it's a problem and sort of work our way out of it, if we could, this time. Because I think it really is this kind of overcorrection that we had in turning towards culture and a critique of ideology in general. right? Um, and the second bit, like, this development, and this kind of overall reliance, in this kind of extremely condescending and unhelpful way that people think about the term called false consciousness. And I'll break down the history of that really quick, but just to give people kind of common sense understanding of what I mean by that, it's the kind of thought that a lot of, especially when you're younger and you start just to become a socialist, right? Like, you've had this realization about the system, and you think that the thing that's sort of standing in between us and like mass socialist revolution is just that, like, your coworkers are just so brainwashed, by society that they don't understand the problems.
Freaking
They don't,
sheep.
and we need to wake people up, right? That's a very, very problematic, um, place to be, both like personally and politically, and I'll break down why. But that's essentially what I mean, by this kind of false consciousness discourse that a lot of people have. Is like, well, people don't know what's good for them, so we're going to tell them, what they need to think and do, right? And let me break this down for y'all, right? Because if there's false consciousness, then there has to be a correct consciousness, and the correct consciousness is what we would call class consciousness. And what is class consciousness? I think there's a couple things that are very, very important to note. Um, Class consciousness is not something that is necessarily innate. It is a possibility, but it is a process. It is something that we construct, right? Class consciousness is understanding your position as a member of a class, the working class, um, and having that understanding sort of govern your politics and your action, right? But if you think about this as just an individual level problem, you'd be making a mistake, because this is a class issue, right? The working class has the potential to be cognizant of themselves, to understand themselves as a class. And because of our radical nature, because of our position in the system as the people who basically produce it, make the system work for everyone else, but also do not get the benefits in the same way that the ruling class does, we have the potential to challenge the system, to eradicate it, to do something different. That's why the working class is the revolutionary class. And to be able to do that, we have to build what is called class consciousness, understanding yourself as not just an individual or Texan or North Dakotan or American or whatever different identity that you have. Understanding yourself first and foremost as a worker and a member of the working class, right? Because remember, class is not the only identity, right? And it won't be the only identity. It's not the only community that you belong to, but it has the potential to focus our attention and to organize us as a movement, as a class, to the fundamental causes of our maladies and of our existence, which are the dictatorship of the rich, capitalism. False consciousness is a term, that maybe some of you aren't familiar with, some of you are familiar with. Um, while Marx did lay the groundwork for this, particularly in Volume 1 of Capital, the term doesn't show up in Marx's work. It shows up in Engels' work. And that doesn't mean that it's not a legitimate term. I'm just taking people through the history here. And Engels throws that term out in a letter to Franz Mehring. It's a prototype that you can find in Marx's writing on ideology. Essentially, ideology is the system that comes out of, ideology is what makes the world make sense to us, right? Ideology is produced by the conditions on the ground, not solely, but the largest force in there are the kind of economic, conditions. And that's where you get this kind of common sense understanding of the way the world works. That's how you get the naturalization of capitalism, and and the relations that we have, right? Where we obscure the relationship, that we have between people into relationships between things, right? And that's ideology, and we can spend a lot of time talking about ideology. I don't want to get too focused on it, because I want to focus on this false consciousness aspect of it, right? What is ideology for working people, and this is what the false consciousness is this kind of inversion that happens, right? This kind of common understanding of the society that we're in. Instead of seeing yourself as members of a community or of a class, you start to think of yourself as individuals. And when this ideology becomes really strong, we start to develop this ideology around individualism, personal responsibility, frankly, kind of anti-solidarity stuff. Think about a term like, or phrase like, God helps those who help themselves, right? That's a very, very strong expression of a highly ideological statement. But I want to note two things, right? One, that is certainly false consciousness, right? So being able to recognize that and to address it, is absolutely something that we need to be building the capacity to do. But also understand that in the absence of radical movements, in the absence of union power, labor power, community, all these kind of organizations, is it absurd that people create ways of thinking and advice that they give themselves and each other that are hyper individualistic, right? In the absence of collective action, in the absence of these kind of more communal movements, is it surprising that people have sort of created entire ideologies around the individual and how that's the only thing that's going to protect you, right? It's wrong, but we need to be able to understand where these things come from if we want to get out of this crisis, right? Because I want to talk about this a bit because I need to clear up some of the confusion around it. Ideology is a necessary thing in the sense that it helps us understand the world around us. It should not be surprising that an ideology has been developed to excuse the inexcusable, to justify the unjustifiable. But for many, many Marxists, the focus on ideology has become an impediment, right? To think that the reason that we are in crisis, the reason that we are not in power, the reason that the workers haven't risen up is just solely and purely ideological, is a mistake, because that means that all we need to do is defeat the popular ideology through argument, reason, maybe media or art, right? Or a big spectacle, and that we would be in a revolutionary time. That's a huge mistake. That might work on a couple folks, but that is not the reason that we are in the moment, right? I don't want to be overly deterministic about these things. Dealing with ideology and mass culture and these things does matter, but I think a lot of people fall into the trap of thinking it's the only thing that matters, right? It clearly blinds us when we're trying to answer the question, why does the working class not stand? This kind of over commitment, this over analysis of ideology blinds us when we're trying to answer the question, why does the working class not stand overwhelmingly with us in a radical revolutionary way? We have to move past this, right? The first problem with the false consciousness stuff is that it's extremely condescending to say, you don't know what you want. Me and my buddies do. We've been reading, journals together, and we figured out your problems for you, right? That's extremely condescending. The second major problem is that this blinds socialists from understanding what is actually happening within our class and how we can move forward, right? The kind of liberal formulation of this is, why does the working class vote against their interests, right? The question we should be asking ourselves is, why is the interest of the working class expressing itself in the ways that it currently is, right? Most notably, on this kind of working class interest thing is people think about Thomas Frank, right, who wrote the famous book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And he notes, to his credit, that more than anything, the blame should not be placed on voters, but on the Democratic Party, who gladly turn their backs on the working class in the state when they stop running on economic issues, healthcare, and redistribution. But we got to go much further than our progressive friends here, right? Is we have to work to understand what happens when people are faced with a seemingly pro-worker option, why workers don't choose it. Because 2 times now, for example, talking about Bernie Sanders, and yeah, it was close and it was rigged, etc. But Bernie Sanders was running on those things and he didn't win, right? We can break down all the reasons why, but it was there. Class consciousness is a process. It's building. It's not just our understanding. We have to be able to build the capacity to act, right? Because winning power, particularly in the state, is just the beginning of the revolution. Like, what did Bernie say? Bernie was always saying, if I come into power, we're going to need big mass movements to get any of the things I want to get, in place. That's the correct analysis, but we were not there. And we weren't building that, frankly, well enough, right? Think of another example. In Alabama, in Bessemer, Amazon rigged the election and they cheated. But you know what people said after the fact? They said, we were afraid if we voted to join the union, we would lose our benefits, we would lose our insurance. And that's 100%, it's correct to say, well, no, the union will fight for you. The union would do all these things, but you know what? People didn't believe that you had the capacity to do it, right? You have to understand that people have these kind of analysis that they have, right? In the sense that there's a short term, my job sucks, blah, blah, blah. But I know if I don't make a big stink, I can keep it and keep these certain things that I have. Versus the long-term kind of more radical position, which is well, we have to fight now to ensure a better future. What our job as socialists is to do is to build up the capacity to people so that we can convince working people in our communities, at our shops and things like that, that when we fight, we win, right? And until we change the material conditions, getting very focused on the kind of ideological, we need to convince this person of this, this, and that, can be a huge, huge mistake. I want to get to our guest here, so I'll just close with this. Socialists are an active body in the working class, right? That means that like these are people who are socialists are committed. Socialists and communists are committed to doing extra work. They're committed very, very much to this movement. Um, and that means that we have to do the work of not just convincing people, for example, that you know your boss is abusing you, that universal health care would be better for you, that being in a union is how you express your power both individually and collectively, but also building the capacity to make those things a reality. That means things like strike funds. That's when you say to somebody you should join a union, you need to be able to provide for them so that if the boss comes with the full strength that power that the bosses have, we can look out for each other, right? And union drives political campaigns and building organizations that can begin to direct and organize our power toward victory, right? We have to have this extra commitment to this as socialists to keep the flame alive at dark times when we're disorganized and fragmented as a movement. And for that reason, and that reason alone, we need to be able to understand what our task is. It's not to like awaken some kind of stupefied masses that doesn't understand what's happening. We need to not just be able to articulate our vision, but we have to start showing through mass movement and organization that we can win immediate victories and then win the world, right? And it's really understanding that it's not that people don't want things or think that their boss is an asshole or think that the power structures of the society aren't working in their favor. People do not believe that we have the plan or the capability to follow through on the things that we're promising. And until we start to really focus on that, we'll never get out of this quagmire, right? And that's why focusing so much, for example, on these kind of false consciousness or ideological things can be a huge impediment, especially if it's preventing people from doing the actual on the ground kind of material analysis as to why we are not in power today.